I'm Jarrett, and this happened a few years ago when I was a student. I was in my third year of college studying business administration. I went to a different school for my first 2 years, and I had just transferred to a larger state school. I was filled with excitement and nerves as I packed my bags and headed off to my new home, a shared house with a bunch of strangers who would be my roommates. I found them on Facebook, and honestly didn't know much about them. I didn't have a lot of options though, and I certainly couldn't afford my own place. When I arrived at the house, I was immediately struck by its charm. It was an older townhouse right near the school, far from luxurious, but definitely good enough. I felt a sense of relief that I wouldn't be living in a tiny dorm. As I walked through the door, I was greeted by the sounds of laughter and chatter coming from the living room. I followed the sound and found my new roommates, all of them busy getting to know each other. There was Alex, a tall, muscular guy with a friendly smile who was studying engineering. Then there was Mike, a smaller guy with a sharp wit who was studying psychology. And finally there was David, a quiet, reserved guy who was studying computer science. They all welcomed me warmly and made me feel at home. I then found out that I was not the only one who was new. They had all met on the Facebook group as well. It turned out that Alex and Mike had also transferred from other schools, and David was the only one who was returning. The first few weeks were great. We all bonded quickly, spending our days studying and attending class. In the evenings, we would cook dinner together and watch movies. It was like I had found a new family, and I was grateful for it. But then, things began to change. I was really bonding with Mike and Alex, but David became more and more reserved over time. It got to the point where I would see him only once or twice a week. He would spend hours locked in his room, only coming out to grab food or use the bathroom. I don't think he was even going to class anymore. He became increasingly aggressive, snapping at anyone who tried to talk to him or ask him how he was doing. I started to feel scared around him and kept my distance. That seemed to help, but his behavior was really creeping me out, and around that time, I started to feel like somebody had been in my room. Things were out of place. I keep my room very tidy, so it's easy for me to notice if my laptop has been moved, or if my clothes have been messed with. I didn't want to think it was true, so I tried to ignore it, and moved on. One night, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, when I heard a noise coming from outside my door. I got up to see who it was, and I was shocked to find David just standing there. I looked up at him, and he had a really creepy look on his face. Then I looked down from his face, and saw that he was holding a pocket knife. It wasn't unfolded or anything, but still it was really scary. Out of nowhere, he lunged at me, and I stumbled back screaming for help. I then tripped over the bed and hit my head on a nightstand. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital, where I was told that David tried to kill me. The doctor said that it could have been a lot worse. I couldn't believe it at first, but as my memory returned, I came to accept it. I was told that Alex had heard me scream and managed to stop David and subdue him. Then he called the cops. I was then told that David was arrested. I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life. I had to withdraw from college and move back home to recover, both physically and mentally. It's been a long and difficult road, but I'm slowly starting to heal. Looking back, I can now see that the warning signs were everywhere, but I didn't want to believe that a friend could be capable of such a thing. It's a hard lesson to learn, but one that I will never forget. I've come to realize that sometimes, even the people closest to us can be capable of great harm. I've returned to college, this time in a different city and with a new set of roommates. I was nervous at first, but quickly found that my new roommates are kind, considerate people who have become my closest friends. I am grateful to have them in my life and have a second chance at college. I still have nightmares about what happened, but I'm learning to face my fears and move forward. This story is about a really horrible thing that happened to me. I'm 28 now, and it was about 5 years ago. It all started when I put my laptop up for sale on Facebook Marketplace. It was a high-end laptop and it was only 1 year old, and it still worked really well, so I figured somebody would be willing to pay a fair price for it. I had come into tough financial times, the details of which I'd rather not get into. That's why I decided to sell it, and try to get another year out of my old one. I received a message from someone who was interested in buying it. They offered me a price that was slightly higher than what I was asking for. A big red flag looking back, but I ignored it. I really needed the money, so I couldn't resist. We agreed to meet up in a parking lot of a grocery store near my apartment. I was excited about the prospect of making a quick sale and getting rid of my laptop. I grabbed my phone and headed out the door, walking the short distance to the parking lot. It was a warm summer day at around 7 p.m. The sun was starting to set, so I knew it would be dark soon. I was hoping to be done before then. When I got to the parking lot, there were a few people milling about the store, but I didn't pay much attention to them. I was focused on finding the buyer and completing the transaction. I walked around for a while, and eventually saw a man leaning against a car in the far corner. I walked over to him, laptop in hand. When I got close, he waved at me, confirming that it was him. He was a tall, muscular man, with a rough, unshaven face and a stern-looking expression. I felt a sudden sense of unease, but I tried to ignore it. After all, I was there to sell my laptop. I opened it up and showed it to the man. He asked me a few questions about its specs and performance. Then he asked me to unlock it so he could make sure it worked. Then I handed it to him, and he gave me the cash. I was counting the money when he suddenly grabbed me by the wrist and twisted my arm behind my back. I cried out in pain and tried to pull away, but he was too strong. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife, then held it to my throat.
"Don't move,"
he growled.
"Just hand over the cash, and forget we ever met."
I was terrified. I'd never been in that kind of situation before, and I didn't know what to do. I quickly handed back the cash, and the man backed away, still holding the knife. He looked at me with a neutral expression. It was like he did this every day. Didn't seem to faze him one bit. He then turned and ran away. I watched in disbelief as he disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing there in shock. I quickly realized that I'd just been robbed. I couldn't believe what just happened. I was shaking and my heart was racing as I pulled out my phone to call the police. They arrived after a few minutes, and I gave them a description of the man and told them that he left on foot. They told me that they would do their best to find him, but that was little comfort to me. The rest of the day was a blur. I felt dazed and disoriented, like it was a dream. I went back to my apartment, but I couldn't sit still. I paced back and forth, trying to make sense of what had happened. I was angry, scared, and overwhelmed. I'd never felt so vulnerable and helpless in my life. The police never caught the man who robbed me. I never saw my laptop again. Obviously, the guy's profile was gone when I checked. Looking back, I know I could have checked the profile to see if it was a real person. That's one of the advantages of using Facebook Marketplace over other sites like Craigslist. You can check their profile and vet out the predators. I didn't do that, and this is what happened to me. I'm a 32-year-old guy, and I live in the United States on the Northeast. This story is about something that happened to me last summer, but it still scares me when I think about it. My roommate had moved out and left me with an extra room in the apartment. I couldn't afford to keep paying the rent on my own. I'd heard of people renting out their spare room on Facebook, so I decided to give it a shot. I created a post with a picture of the room and a brief description of the apartment, then I hit post. Within a few hours, I started getting responses. The first reply came from a guy named Jeremy, who said he was interested in moving in. He seemed friendly enough, but something about his tone made me uneasy. His voice was very monotone, almost robotic. I looked past it though. Not everyone's comfortable talking on the phone. I suggested that we meet up in public first. That way we could get to know each other. When I suggested that, he refused and said he just wanted to move in right away. That gave me a really bad feeling, so I told him that I was going to move on and find someone else. Then he sent me a really angry message, including some horrible insults and even threats. The scariest thing happened next. He sent me a picture of a black handgun, just sitting on a table. I had no way to know if it was really his, or if it was just a picture that he found somewhere to scare me. After that, I blocked him and went to bed. A few days went by, and then I received another response. This time it was from a man named Justin. He seemed nice, and we exchanged a few messages. Then he asked if we could meet at a bar for a drink to discuss the room. I agreed, and we made plans to meet at a local bar. When I arrived, I saw a man sitting alone. He looked like he was waiting for someone, so I walked up and introduced myself. It was Justin, so I took a seat, and we got to talking. We chatted for a while. He told me about his job and his hobbies. He seemed normal, and I was starting to feel more comfortable with the whole thing. After a while, though, I noticed something about his voice. It sounded too familiar. He had that same monotone voice as the other guy from before. I became suspicious that Justin was actually Jeremy, so I made an excuse to leave. I gathered my things quickly and said goodbye. But as I was leaving, Jeremy grabbed my arm and said,
You can't run away from me that easily.
I was scared and started to panic, but then I remembered that I had my phone with me, so I pulled it out with my other hand and dialed 911. When he realized that, he released me, and I ran out of that bar. The operator told me to stay on the line, and within a few minutes, the police arrived. Jeremy was arrested, and I was shaken, but grateful to be safe. When the police searched him, they found a gun that looked really similar to the one in the picture that he'd sent. If I had allowed that guy to come back to my apartment to look at the room, then I could have been in big trouble. Luckily, that didn't happen, and I got away. I still have no idea what that guy's problem was. I ended up finding a roommate through some of my friends. In my opinion, that's a much better way than meeting strangers online. If at all possible, that's what I would recommend. This all happened about 10 years ago, when I was in my early 20s. I was scrolling through Facebook one day, when I noticed I had a friend request from someone I didn't recognize. Their profile was just a silhouette. Their name was unfamiliar to me. I usually don't accept friend requests from people I don't know, but for some reason, I felt curious about this person. I accepted the request, and we started chatting. The stranger, who called himself Mark, was charming and friendly at first. He asked me about my life and my interests. We quickly bonded over our shared love for music. I found myself looking forward to our conversations and spending time chatting with him. Mark seemed genuinely interested in me, and that really drew me in. However, things started to take a dark turn when Mark started asking me more personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, my schedule, and even started commenting on my photos and posts. I started feeling uncomfortable and decided to end the friendship. That's when the real horror began. I started receiving messages from Mark at all hours of the day and night, asking me why I hadn't been replying. When I refused to respond, he began sending more and more disturbing messages, including one where he referenced the coffee shop where I worked at the time. And I knew for a fact that I'd never told him any personal details like that. I became afraid for my safety and decided to go to the police. They told me that because we only communicated online, there was very little they could do. There was no way to know if we were even in the same country. I felt helpless and alone, unsure of what to do next. Then he started leaving scary messages on my phone and even threatened to show up at my house. I was terrified, and I didn't know what to do. I started to feel like I was being watched. All this trouble from someone I'd never even met. He didn't even have a profile picture. For all I knew, anybody on the street could be him, and I would be oblivious. My paranoia grew over time, and I started sleeping with the lights on. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows every night. I was always looking over my shoulder. My once normal and happy life became a constant state of fear and anxiety. One day, I received a message from Mark saying that he knew where I was and that I couldn't escape him. That was the final straw. I called the police, and this time, they took me more seriously. I guess it made a difference to them when he threatened to come to me in person. I'm not sure why they didn't do that before. I eventually heard back from the police. They told me that they contacted Mark and gave him a warning to leave me alone. I never heard from him again after that, but I was really scared for months, if not years afterwards. I still use social media, but I'm much more cautious about who I accept into my life. I've learned to be vigilant and trust my instincts. The internet can be a wonderful place, but it can also be dangerous.